Hey guys, AK88 on cars. Okay, so today we're going to talk about, should you consider buying a British sports car? I've owned German sports cars, I've owned Japanese sports cars, but what about the British sports car? So today I'm going to give you 3 things to think about, from 1, what makes them great and quirky, 2, some of the downsides that you should think about, and 3, after 2 years of ownership myself, what are my thoughts and recommendations? Let's get into it. So some of you may know that I came to owning a British sports car not originally by choice. So my late father, David, bought a brand new VX220 Turbo back in 2004. And a few years ago he unfortunately died of cancer fairly quickly, and I ended up inheriting the car. I tried to make this an extension of his legacy, so I spent the last 2 years restoring the car and trying to make the best version of the car that it can be. But let's get into some of the quirky stuff that I've learned over those 2 years, which I almost wish I knew 2 years ago before, because I may have actually considered British sports cars a little bit earlier. Now, there's a huge variety of British sports cars, but probably the most well-known version of that are Lotuses. And Lotuses have a number of models that they stand on by themselves. The amazing Elise, which has gone through a number of iterations now, to the brand new Amira, which has just come out, and I was watching JM on Car's brilliant review of that, which you can check out somewhere up here. But let's get on to what's quirky and good. So the first thing that I really respected about British sports cars is they really do a great job of a ground up build. So what I tended to find with some of my other German and Japanese sports cars is, in certain areas they were incredibly well refined, certainly in the design of their engine, their looks and everything else. But they were trying to be a car of different sorts, and sometimes that makes a fantastic car. If you watch my Porsche Boxster video, which is up one of here, you will hear me talking about how having a dual personality is one of the best things of that car. But because British sports cars start from the ground up, what they end up producing is some of the most focused and, in certain ways, most spectacular functions of cars going. Now, for Lotus, one of the things that it's incredibly well known for is the quality of its chassis. It's bonded and riveted chassis, which keeps it incredibly light, as well as maintaining great rigidity as well as feel through the road. And I don't think I realised how good a chassis could be until I started driving the VX220. It is just absolutely sublime, both in how it drives normally over normal roads, but especially to when you put it into corners, be it in fast road use or track use. And that focus is something that I think other car manufacturers cannot in many ways afford to do. So the reason why the Porsches are so popular and the Boxster was so excellent was because it had mass market appeal. But British sports cars are more focused on a certain type of enthusiast, whether it's the quirkiness of Morgan or perhaps the more track-focused version of Lotus. The other thing that makes them really fantastic, but at the same time limiting, is how they use parts. So nearly every sports car that comes out of a British manufacturer, except for when TVR went through that whole bonkers stage of designing their own engine, they tend to use engines from well-tested mainstream production cars. So the VX220 Turbo that my dad bought has a Z20 turbo engine. This is the same engine that in one iteration or another that sort of fast Vauxhalls, be it Astras, be it Zefiras, and be it in other versions of Vauxhalls, have used for almost 20 years. The downside of that is you lose the slight specialness that I got used to in Porsches, or you go over to the Japanese sports car. Think of the S2000 with its F20 engine. That's a very unique engine as well. So we lose that a little bit here. But on the plus side, what it means is every time something goes wrong, the availability of parts, both new, second-hand and reproduction, are just through the roof. And even if you're in America, for example, and you're trying to enjoy a British sports car, there's always the slight allure that even if the US runs out of parts or they're not so readily available, the UK is just a freight journey away, and actually most supply part companies now very happily deliver internationally. And that is magnificent. When I had the Porsche, one time I thought I destroyed the gearbox, and what actually happened is the retention springs in the rear drum brakes, which were only used for the caliper, for the handbrake, not actually for the rear braking and the rear discs, broke. And I, other than the stress of what that could cause, the replacement of these two little springs was sort of 60 quid. Whereas if it all goes wrong and the engine in the VX20 explodes, I literally can go and get the base shell of the engine from pretty much most breakers' yards for 200 to 300 quid. And that's appealing, right? That's appealing for many of us that want the enjoyment of sports cars, but not the huge amount of expense that comes with them. I think the other thing is the community and how it forces you to get out there. Never have I driven cars so much abroad than since I've had Dad's VX220. We've been to France, we've been to Switzerland, last year we went to Italy, and I don't know what it is, but something makes me want to take this car abroad, and even into places that it shouldn't go into, so places that it would bottom out getting into certain hotels, in a way that the Boxster or the S2000 wouldn't do. But for some reason, I keep wanting it to take it back abroad. Now, here's Car Alex with a couple of other things that he really likes about the VX220. Check it out.
Despite being really difficult to get in, once you're in, it's actually a remarkably nice place to be, especially when you're by yourself. These sills on the side actually act as quite a nice armrest position, and despite the car effectively being sat on the floor, the seats only are probably raised sort of 2-3 centimetres above that floor position. It's surprisingly comfortable. Another really great thing in here is the driving position. So in this particular car, like in many Lotuses and VX is of the chassis, the steering wheel is fixed. You can't adjust it. There's no rack or pinion, so what you get is what you're given. However, despite this, the position seems to suit most drivers quite well. The steering wheel is now a little bit closer than perhaps I would normally have it, but actually that makes the drive really quite engaging.
Now let's get on to talking about some of the things that are potentially problematic that are worth considering before you take the plunge to buy a car. Now, the first thing I would say is build quality. Now, all eyes have been on Lotus recently with the unveiling of the Emira and other models to see if the British sports car lineage of build quality could be rectified. And this is something that goes back way back, even to luxury brands like Rolls-Royce. When they make their cars, handmade was sort of a double-edged sword. It probably meant it was going to be really exquisite and something that was difficult to replicate for more mainstream manufacturers, but at the same time it was more likely to fail or fall off or something of that nature. Now, my experience with living with the VX for 2 years has been that occasionally it's quite common to come back and some part of the dash has kind of fallen off or some plastic bit has come off, and Car Alex which I will cut to in a minute, will elevate some of the other more noise related issues that can happen as much of the car. But you almost do forget it as soon as you get behind the driver's seat on an open stretch of road with some nice weather. It kind of, you become blinkered and you only see the good stuff. But it's worth knowing that is something that almost will be inevitable with any British sports car. Now, going hand in hand with that, the other part is the usability and livability. So in my experience, the time when I see people selling British sports cars are very different in many ways to when I saw people selling, for example, their S2000 or their Porsche. And what I think is the issue here is they're just not as livable. So I think most people know that getting into a Lotus, certainly the more older ones, is a bit of a stretch. There's a whole sort of get one leg in and then you sort of got to get your butt in and then slide in, and it's not very pleasant, but it's all part of the experience. Also, British sports cars are known for being smaller and lighter, and coming with that thus leads to less amount of space, both in cabins as well as in the boot. And what it becomes more difficult to do is it's the sort of car that after a while, even wanting to take it into work becomes a bit monotonous. And the reason why I see people selling British sports cars is just because either they don't use it at all, so perhaps they've owned it for many years, even more than 5, and they're just not finding the dedicated time to get the most out of the car, or B, after a sort of a shorter period of time, like a year or two, again, that livability, it just becomes a bit of a pain. So it's the sort of thing that you should consider if you've got the time and space to have a second car. But if you're looking for a car of two sorts, British sports cars haven't really historically had that. Let's see if the Emira and other similar cars provide that longevity that Lotus have been craving for the last couple of years. The other thing is the price of some parts. So you heard me saying sort of the wrong great thing is, they use standardized engines. For example, at the moment, Lotus is using a Toyota V6 that they supercharge for the last couple of generations worth of their cars, as well as an AMG turbocharged unit as well. That's great. But there is inevitably a certain amount of points that become unique. So for the VX220, one of the unique parts is if the windscreen ever gets chipped or damaged, replacing it is an absolute nightmare. It's a nightmare to get hold of the unit, but then a lot of the glass fitters, especially in the UK, won't fit the windscreen unless sort of the front clam is sort of removed and taken off, and even then sometimes they come and say no, and that's a real pain as well. So there's a number of other little parts like that will be unique, that will be incredibly expensive. Lights are another one. Headlights and rear lights, no one really makes pattern parts for them, and a set of those can go currently anywhere from sort of £500 to £1,000 for a replacement. Really quite rare. So I'm now going to hand over to Car Alex yet again to explain some and demonstrate some other annoying problems. Please take this with a pinch of salt because this particular VX220 is a little bit beefed up, but let's see what he's got to say.
So I don't know if you can pick this up in here, but the other problem is rattles. So in the very first review I ever watched of the VX220, which was on Top Gear, even Clarkson, in his media test version of the VX, remarked that it made rattle noises. The same is true from here. Now I don't know if the mic's picking up, but there's kind of one coming from behind me, there's another one on the dash over there, and occasionally there's one on the dashboard too. So now that we turn the engine off, it gives me a chance to talk about another problem. Now, anyone that's come out of COVID and has taken an economy flight may have noticed in that sort of 18 months, 2 years when we couldn't travel, the airlines have somehow made our seats even narrower than before, and you can't sit in them without touching two sides of the other people. However, Lotus has nailed this down since its inception. So anytime you sit in a Lotus, especially ones built on the Elise platform, such as this car, you're never really going to have too much of your own space when you're sitting in here with somebody else. Now, I don't know if the camera can see this, but the slither between these two seats is tiny. They are practically touching each other. So if you're potentially a dude driving this car and you're going to take your friend in the passenger seat, just know that you're going to get sort of friendly rubbing arm experience together, which to counter that, you develop what's known as the Lotus Lean.
So after 2 years worth of ownership, from someone that didn't think that they would be a British sports car owner initially, what are my thoughts, what are my suggestions, and is it really worth it? Is the sacrifice for the additional je ne sais quoi worth it over German and Japanese rivals? So here's where I would be on this. So I think the first thing I'd say is the cost of living with the car is a recipe that makes it easy to buy one. So one of the issues with especially German cars is if something goes wrong, it's worryingly expensive to both keep and service. Now, that might not be a concern for some people, and my hat's off to you if that is. But even as I go through later in life, that sort of frivolous spending that we do, we sort of try to keep in sort of check and try to be responsible adults. And I think British sports cars help you do that in a way that satisfies adult brain. Because they are cheap to service, there's so many available parts, Lots of people make pattern replicas of parts. I think it's a real recipe to consider, especially when you're looking at the price of new or more expensive cars. The other thing is they are also quite cheap by retrospect to tune. And that means you can get involved in track days and you don't always necessarily feel like you're the only stock car on the circuit, and that's a bad thing. I think, again, the community around you will accept it whether you've got a stock car or not, and will help you, and it's easy for you to design the car in a way that suits your needs, not somebody else's. The other thing is it will help you make friends as well as reunite you with friends. So I'm going to show you a clip now of my friend Ross and I doing our first 0 to 60 tests in the car, and I'm going to show you a clip that you haven't seen, and just check out the huge, I'm not going to edit it or cut it, check out us laughing with the just pure enjoyment of doing 0 to 60 runs for the first time in, God, 10 years? Check it out. So sorry for eardrums if the laughing was so loud, but that is a typical moment, whether you're with old friends, making new friends, or by yourselves. It will never stop to put a smile on your face, regardless of what price point you're going into. The other thing I'd say is it's probably worth it. You know, I think all of us have had time to reflect during our lives about when we are inevitably reminded how short life is. And I think adult brain would allow the financial expenditure for a British sports car to make sense. And I think in 30 years, 20 years time, when you're looking back, you'll realise how many amazing memories you made because of the car. Whether it gave you a new lease of life, whether it got you out there more, whether you made new friends, whether you were going abroad, or whether you were just scratching that itch to see if you wanted to do that. You know, perhaps it's your first ever sports car. I just think that is the recipe that makes British sports cars so brilliant. So finally, we're going to quickly finish with my recommendations if this video may have sort of pushed you over the edge to start looking for a British sports car. So a few recommendations. So the first one will be always try and buy from someone that's known. These communities are really, really small in most cases. You know, in the VX220 community, for example, there is only something like, I think, 950 VX220 turbos ever made as well. So if you're looking at a car, posting it on some of the Facebook groups or the ownership forums, will normally find that one of the owners, if not the original owner, may come forward and tell you some of the history about the car. And buying it from a car that's known generally means that there's no surprise. The other thing I'd say is this is probably one of the type of cars that I would suggest definitely not buying if it's ever been written off. You know, especially these chassis that are bonded, they're aluminium, they're quite delicate. Sometimes to knock such a chassis out of balance, I think might detract from some of the enjoyment of the car, and really the price point between the two doesn't really provide you as much of a saving as it perhaps would do for German and Japanese cars. I would also say find a specialist to work with. Most of the community are served by specialists, and they're generally sort of a spectrum of how great they are and which market they cater for. But find someone that you trust to work with. Be prepared perhaps to travel a little bit, because that would be worth it. Anyway guys, thanks for tuning in. What do you think of this video? Did any of those sort of points ring true with you if you own a British sports car? And I'm curious if you thought I missed anything, if you're in that bracket of maybe I want to buy a British sports car and I missed something. Please leave me a comment, please leave me a like, and if you like the content, please do consider subscribing to my channel. Otherwise guys, take care of yourself and catch you in the next one. Cheers.